Sarah Martinez had seen enough violence in her 12 years as a SWAT team member to last several lifetimes. The single mother of 2 teenagers thought those dangerous days were behind her when she retired from the force 3 years ago to focus on raising her kids and running a small security consulting business from her home in the quiet suburbs of Phoenix. That peaceful evening in late September started like any other. Sarah was helping her 16-year-old daughter Emma with college applications, while her 14-year-old son Jake practiced guitar in his room. The family had just finished dinner when Sarah noticed the acrid smell of smoke drifting through their living room window. Her training kicked in immediately. Sarah's senses, honed by years of tactical operations, told her something was very wrong. She stepped onto her front porch and saw orange flames dancing around her white pickup truck parked in the driveway. The vehicle she used for work calls and hauling equipment was completely engulfed in fire. 3 figures in dark hoodies stood across the street, watching the destruction with obvious satisfaction. When they spotted Sarah on her porch, they didn't run. Instead, they laughed and pointed at the burning truck. One of them pulled out his phone and started recording her reaction, clearly enjoying her shock and anger. Sarah's neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the smoke and the sound of crackling flames. Mrs. Chen from next door called 911 while other residents gathered on the sidewalk, whispering among themselves about who could have done such a thing in their normally peaceful neighborhood. The fire department arrived within 8 minutes, but by then Sarah's truck was a total loss. The intense heat had melted the tires and shattered all the windows. Her work equipment worth thousands of dollars was destroyed, including specialized security cameras and installation tools she needed for her business. Detective Ray Harrison, a former colleague from her SWAT days, took her statement. He explained that there had been 3 similar vehicle arsons in the area over the past month, all targeting women who lived alone or were single mothers. The perpetrators seemed to be choosing their victims carefully, studying their routines and striking when they felt confident about getting away clean. Sarah learned that the 3 suspects were part of a larger group that had been terrorizing the neighborhood for weeks. They called themselves the Night Riders and saw themselves as some kind of vigilante gang. Their social media posts, which Detective Harrison showed her on his tablet, revealed a disturbing pattern of targeting what they called uppity women who needed to be put in their place. The leader of the group was Marcus Webb, a 23-year-old with a long history of petty crimes and a particular hatred for law enforcement. His followers were mostly teenagers and young men in their early 20s who had embraced his twisted philosophy about teaching women lessons through intimidation and property destruction. Sarah watched her truck being towed away as evidence. She felt a familiar anger building inside her. This wasn't random vandalism or a prank gone wrong. This was a deliberate attack designed to make her feel vulnerable and afraid. The perpetrators had picked the wrong target if they thought a former SWAT officer would cower in fear. Emma and Jake stood beside their mother, both shaken by what they had witnessed. Emma asked if they should stay somewhere else for the night, worried that the attackers might come back. Jake, trying to act tough despite his obvious fear, suggested they should buy security cameras and maybe get a guard dog. Sarah put her arms around both her children and made them a promise that would prove prophetic in the days to come. She told them that nobody was going to chase their family out of their home or make them live in fear. She had spent her career protecting people from criminals and bullies, and she wasn't about to let some wannabe tough guys think they could intimidate her or her kids. That night, after the police had finished their investigation and the neighbors had returned to their homes, Sarah sat at her kitchen table making lists. She wrote down everything she remembered about the 3 figures she had seen, their approximate heights and builds, the brands of clothing they wore, and the type of phone one had used to record the fire. Her SWAT training had taught her to gather intelligence methodically and plan operations carefully. She pulled out her laptop and began researching everything she could find about the recent arsons in her neighborhood. She studied police reports, news articles, and social media posts, building a profile of the people who had targeted her family. Detective Harrison had promised to investigate thoroughly, but Sarah knew how slowly the legal system moved. She also knew that without solid evidence or witnesses willing to testify, the chances of prosecuting the arsonists were slim. The Night Riders had been careful to avoid security cameras and had chosen isolated targets who couldn't fight back effectively. Sarah's Security consulting business had taught her about the gaps in neighborhood surveillance and how criminals exploited those weaknesses. She realized that the arsonists had probably been watching her house for days or even weeks, learning her schedule and waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. As she prepared for bed that night, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to wait for the police to solve this case or hope that the attackers would simply lose interest and move on to easier targets. Her years of tactical training and her deep understanding of criminal behavior had given her skills that most victims didn't possess. The night riders thought they had successfully intimidated another single mother, but they had actually awakened something far more dangerous than they could imagine. Sarah Martinez was no ordinary victim, and she was about to show them exactly what happened when professional warriors decided to fight back against amateur bullies who preyed on innocent families. The morning after the attack, Sarah dropped her kids off at school and began her own investigation. She had called in sick to her planned security consultation appointment, knowing that catching these criminals was now her top priority. Her first stop was the coffee shop 3 blocks from her house, where she had noticed several young men hanging out in recent weeks. The barista, a college student named Ashley, remembered seeing the group Sarah described. They had been regulars for about a month, always ordering cheap coffee and spending hours on their laptops and phones. Ashley mentioned that they often talked loudly about teaching lessons to various people in the neighborhood, though she hadn't paid much attention to their conversations at the time. Sarah asked to see the security footage from the previous evening, but the coffee shop's cameras only covered the interior and didn't capture the parking lot where the suspects might have gathered before the attack. However, Ashley provided valuable information about the group's usual schedule and the names she had overheard them using for each other. Armed with this intelligence, Sarah drove to the nearby community college where several witnesses had mentioned seeing similar groups of young men. She posed as a concerned parent asking about campus security, which allowed her to speak with security guards and administrators who dealt with troublemakers regularly. The head of campus security, Officer Jim Walsh, knew exactly who Sarah was describing. Marcus Webb had been banned from the college library 6 months earlier for harassing female students and making threatening comments about women who acted like they were better than everyone else. 2 of his known associates, Tyler Ross and Brandon Kim, were current students who had been written up multiple times for disruptive behavior. Officer Walsh shared that the trio had been suspected of vandalizing cars belonging to female professors and students, but they had never been caught in the act. The security cameras showed them in the area during several incidents, but always with alibis and never actually committing crimes on camera. Sarah realized she was dealing with individuals who understood basic surveillance, countermeasures, but weren't sophisticated enough to avoid leaving other types of evidence. Her SWAT experience had taught her that most criminals made mistakes when they became overconfident, and these young men clearly felt invincible after getting away with their attacks. She spent the afternoon visiting auto parts stores and gas stations in the area, looking for anyone who might have sold supplies that could be used for arson. At the 3rd location she visited, a teenager working behind the counter remembered selling several containers of lighter fluid and emergency road flares to 3 young men the day before. Her truck was burned. The clerk described the buyers perfectly, even remembering that one of them had argued about using a credit card before ultimately paying cash. The store's security camera had captured clear images of all 3 suspects, and the timestamp showed they had made their purchase just 2 hours before Sarah's truck was set on fire. This was the breakthrough Sarah needed, but she knew she had to be careful about how she handled the evidence. As a former law enforcement officer, she understood the importance of maintaining the chain of custody and ensuring that any evidence she gathered would be admissible in court. Sarah contacted Detective Harrison and arranged to meet him at the auto parts store. She explained her investigation methods carefully, emphasizing that she had acted as a concerned citizen, gathering information that might be helpful to the official investigation. She made sure to present her findings in a way that wouldn't compromise any potential prosecution. Detective Harrison was impressed by Sarah's thoroughness, but also concerned about her safety. He warned her that the night riders had a history of escalating their attacks against people who challenged them. 2 months earlier, a woman who had confronted them about harassment had found her car windows smashed and threatening notes left on her doorstep. Despite the detective's warnings, Sarah continued her investigation that evening. She had learned from Officer Walsh that the suspects often gathered at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town, where they planned their activities and celebrated their successful attacks. She decided to conduct surveillance on the location to gather more intelligence about their operations. Sarah parked across the street from the diner in her rental car, using binoculars to observe the parking lot and entrance. Her patience was rewarded when Marcus Webb and 4 other young men arrived in 2 separate vehicles around 10 p.m. She recognized Tyler Ross and Brandon Kim from the security camera footage, along with 2 new faces she hadn't seen before. Through the diner's large windows, Sarah could see the group celebrating and looking at videos on their phones. Their body language and excited gestures suggested they were reliving their recent attacks and planning new ones. She took detailed notes about their vehicles, license plate numbers, and the length of their meeting. When the group finally left the diner around midnight, Sarah faced a crucial decision. She could follow them to see where they went next, potentially gathering more evidence about their plans. However, conducting mobile surveillance alone was dangerous, especially if they discovered they were being watched. Sarah chose to follow at a safe distance, using techniques she had learned during her SWAT career. She maintained visual contact while staying far enough back to avoid detection, turning her headlights off when necessary, and using alternate routes to parallel their path. The convoy of suspects drove to a residential area where several young men lived in a rundown apartment complex. Sarah observed them unloading supplies from their cars, including what appeared to be more lighter fluid and other materials that could be used for arson. She documented everything with her phone's camera, being careful to capture clear images without exposing her position. As she watched the suspects enter one of the apartments, Sarah realized she had gathered enough evidence to significantly advance the official investigation. However, she also understood that her amateur surveillance had revealed something troubling about the group's capabilities and intentions. The Night Riders weren't just random vandals looking for easy targets. They had developed a systematic approach to their attacks, with designated roles for different members and careful planning that suggested more serious crimes might be in their future. Sarah's professional instincts told her that the situation was about to escalate far beyond simple property destruction. The next morning, Sarah compiled all her evidence into a comprehensive report for Detective Harrison. She included photographs, witness statements, timeline analysis, and her professional assessment of the threat level posed by the suspects. Her law enforcement background allowed her to present the information in a format that would be immediately useful to the investigating officers. However, Sarah also began making preparations of her own. She knew that catching criminals was only half the battle, and that protecting her family required proactive measures that went beyond relying on the justice system. Her years of tactical training had taught her that the best defense was often a strong offense, especially when dealing with predators who targeted the vulnerable. 3 days after Sarah had provided her evidence to Detective Harrison, the Night Riders discovered they were being investigated. Someone had seen Sarah taking photographs near their apartment complex and recognized her as the woman whose truck had been burned. Marcus Webb was furious that his victim had dared to fight back instead of simply accepting the intimidation. The retaliation came swiftly and was more vicious than Sarah had anticipated. She woke up Thursday morning to find her front lawn covered with garbage, broken glass, and spray-painted messages calling her degrading names. Her mailbox had been destroyed with a baseball bat, and someone had thrown eggs at her house windows during the night. But the most disturbing discovery was a note stuck to her front door with a kitchen knife. The handwritten message was brief but terrifying in its implications. It threatened her children by name and included details about their school schedules that proved the attackers had been watching Emma and Jake closely. The note ended with a warning that worse things would happen if Sarah didn't stop playing detective. Sarah immediately called both Detective Harrison and her children's schools to report the threats. Emma's high school and Jake's middle school agreed to increase security and watch for suspicious individuals. But Sarah knew that schools had limited resources and couldn't provide round-the-clock protection. That afternoon, while Sarah was installing additional security cameras around her property, she received a phone call that made her blood run cold. The voice was young and male, clearly disguised but still recognizable as one of the suspects she had observed at the diner. The caller described exactly what Emma was wearing that day and mentioned that Jake had guitar practice after school. The terrorist, On the phone explained in graphic detail what would happen to her children if Sarah continued interfering with their business, and he described specific acts of violence that showed these weren't empty threats from amateur criminals. Someone in the group had experience with serious crimes and knew exactly how to terrorize a mother through her deepest fears. Sarah's SWAT training had taught her how to handle threatening phone calls, but this was different because her children were the targets. She kept the caller on the line long enough to record the conversation and try to gather identifying information, but the suspect was careful not to reveal anything that could be traced back to him. After the call ended, Sarah made the difficult decision to send Emma and Jake to stay with her sister in Tucson for a few days. She told her children it was just a precaution, but both teenagers understood that the situation had become genuinely dangerous. Emma cried as she packed her bags, angry that criminals were forcing their family apart. With her children safely out of town, Sarah felt free to take more aggressive action against the Night Riders. She contacted several former SWAT teammates who had also retired from law enforcement and explained the situation. Within hours, she had assembled an informal network of experienced professionals who were willing to help protect her family and gather intelligence on the suspects. Her former partner, Mike Rodriguez, had started a private investigation agency after leaving the force. He agreed to conduct background checks on all the known suspects and look for connections that might help law enforcement build a stronger case. Mike's resources included access to databases and surveillance equipment that weren't available to ordinary citizens. Another former colleague, Lisa Park, worked for a security company that specialized in protecting executives from corporate espionage and threats. Lisa offered to install military-grade surveillance, equipment around Sarah's property, and teach her how to use advanced counter-surveillance techniques to detect when she was being watched. The third member of Sarah's informal team was Carlos Mendez, a former SWAT sniper who now worked as a firearms instructor. Carlos was concerned that the threats against Sarah's children indicated the suspects were planning to escalate to physical violence, possibly including kidnapping or assault. He offered to provide advanced weapons training and help Sarah develop defensive strategies for protecting her family. As Sarah's team began gathering intelligence, they discovered that the Night Riders were more dangerous than anyone had realized. Marcus Webb had connections to a white supremacist group that operated throughout Arizona and neighboring states. Several of his associates had arrest records for assault, domestic violence, and weapons charges that hadn't shown up in the initial police investigation. The group's social media activity revealed a disturbing ideology that combined misogyny with racial hatred and anti-government extremism. They saw themselves as warriors in a broader cultural war against women, minorities, and anyone who challenged traditional power structures. Sarah's status as a former law enforcement officer made her a particularly attractive target for their violence. Mike Rodriguez discovered that the Night Riders had been planning their attacks for months, using social media to identify victims and coordinate their activities. They had detailed files on dozens of women in the Phoenix area, including photographs, home addresses, work schedules, and personal information gathered through online stalking and physical surveillance. The most chilling discovery was evidence that the group had been planning to graduate from property destruction to kidnapping and sexual assault. Phone records obtained through unofficial channels showed discussions about teaching the cop lady a real lesson that included explicit descriptions of violent crimes they intended to commit against Sarah and her children. Detective Harrison was grateful for the intelligence that Sarah's team provided, but he was also frustrated by the limitations of official law enforcement. The district attorney's office was reluctant to file serious charges based on circumstantial evidence, and the suspects' lawyers were already claiming that their clients were being targeted by vigilante ex-cops who had no legal authority to investigate crimes. The legal system's slow pace became irrelevant when the Night Riders decided to force a confrontation. Marcus Webb had grown tired of playing cat-and-mouse games and wanted to send a message that would discourage other victims from fighting back. He began planning an attack on Sarah's house that would eliminate her as a threat and demonstrate his group's power to anyone who might consider opposing them. Sarah's surveillance equipment detected the planning stages of this attack when her cameras captured several suspects conducting reconnaissance around her neighborhood. They were taking photographs of her house from different angles, timing the patrol schedules of local police, and identifying escape routes that would allow them to flee quickly after committing their crimes. Lisa Park's analysis of the surveillance footage revealed that the suspects were planning a home invasion rather than another simple act of vandalism. Their behavior patterns and equipment suggested they intended to enter Sarah's house and wait for her to return, possibly planning to hold her hostage while demanding that she stop her investigation. This intelligence forced Sarah to make a crucial decision about how far she was willing to go to protect her family and stop the Night Riders. Her law enforcement training had always emphasized working within the legal system, but the legal system was failing to protect innocent people from escalating threats of violence. Sarah realized that she was facing the same type of tactical situation that she had handled dozens of times during her SWAT career, except now she was the target instead of the rescuer. The skills that had made her an effective law enforcement officer were about to be tested in a very different context, where the rules of engagement would be determined by survival rather than legal procedure. Sarah spent the weekend transforming her home into a tactical fortress while maintaining the appearance of normal suburban life. Her years of SWAT training had taught her how to prepare for hostile situations, but this time she was defending her own territory instead of assaulting a criminal stronghold. Every decision had to balance security with the need to avoid alerting the Night Riders that she was ready for their attack. Lisa Park helped install motion sensors and silent alarms throughout the house, creating multiple layers of early warning systems that would detect intruders long before they reached the main living areas. The equipment was military-grade but designed to be invisible to casual observation, hidden in light fixtures, smoke detectors, and other everyday household items that wouldn't attract suspicious attention. Mike Rodriguez positioned himself in a surveillance van 3 blocks away, where he could monitor the entire neighborhood through a network of wireless cameras. His position allowed him to track the movements of any suspicious vehicles and provide real-time intelligence to Sarah about approaching threats. He also maintained contact with Detective Harrison, ensuring that law enforcement would be notified immediately when the attack began. Carlos Mendez took up a sniper position in the vacant house directly across the street, which had been for sale for 6 months. The Homeowners Association had given him permission to conduct security inspections of the property, providing legal cover for his presence and allowing him to establish clear fields of fire, covering Sarah's front and backyards. Sarah herself remained inside her house, maintaining her normal evening routine while wearing body armor under her casual clothes. She had strategically placed weapons throughout the building, ensuring that she would never be more than a few steps away from a loaded firearm, regardless of where the attack originated. Her kitchen table had been cleared to provide workspace for communications equipment and tactical maps of the surrounding area. The waiting was the hardest part. Sarah's police training had taught her to be patient during surveillance operations, but this situation was different because her family's safety depended on her performance. Every sound outside could signal the beginning of the attack, and every minute that passed increased the psychological pressure on everyone involved in the operation. At 9:47 p.m., Mike Rodriguez's voice crackled through Sarah's earpiece with the alert she had been expecting. 2 vehicles had entered the neighborhood and were driving slowly past houses while their occupants studied the area. The license plates matched vehicles that had been observed during previous Night Riders' activities, confirming that the attack was about to begin. Sarah moved to her predetermined position behind the kitchen counter, which provided both cover from incoming gunfire and clear sightlines to all the main entry points of her house. Her breathing became controlled and steady as her body shifted into the tactical mindset that had kept her alive during dozens of dangerous operations. The Night Riders parked their vehicles 4 blocks away and approached Sarah's house on foot, using techniques they had learned from watching action movies and playing video games. Their movements were clumsy compared to trained operators, but they showed enough coordination to indicate that someone had provided basic instruction in small unit tactics. Carlos Mendez tracked their approach through his sniper scope, providing detailed updates about their positions and equipment. The attackers were carrying crowbars, baseball bats, and what appeared to be at least 2 firearms. Their plan seemed to involve forcing entry through the back door while creating a distraction at the front of the house. Marcus Webb had brought 5 other gang members for the attack, believing that overwhelming numbers would compensate for their lack of professional training. He planned to capture Sarah alive and use her as an example to intimidate other victims. recording video of her torture and humiliation to post on social media as a warning to anyone who might consider fighting back. At 10:23 p.m., the attack began with two suspects attempting to cut Sarah's phone lines while the others took positions around the house. They didn't realize that Sarah was using encrypted radio communications that couldn't be disrupted by simple sabotage, or that their every movement was being recorded by hidden cameras that would provide evidence for later prosecution. The Night Riders' first mistake was underestimating the security measures that Sarah had installed. When they tried to force the back door, they triggered multiple silent alarms and activated floodlights that temporarily blinded them while alerting everyone on Sarah's team. The element of surprise that they had counted on was gone before they even entered the house. Their second mistake was assuming that Sarah would be hiding in fear rather than waiting in ambush. When Marcus Webb and two associates finally broke through the reinforced back door, they expected to find a terrified woman cowering in her bedroom. Instead, they walked into a carefully prepared kill zone where a trained, tactical operator was waiting with superior weapons and professional expertise. Sarah's voice cut through the darkness with the authority of someone who had commanded respect in life-or-death situations. She identified herself as a former police officer and ordered the intruders to drop their weapons and surrender immediately. Her tone made it clear that she was not making a request but giving a final warning before using deadly force. Marcus Webb's response was exactly what Sarah had anticipated. Instead of surrendering, he screamed threats and raised his pistol toward where he thought her voice had originated. His two companions also attempted to bring their weapons into play, confirming that they intended to commit murder rather than simple assault. Sarah's tactical training took over as she engaged multiple targets in rapid succession. Her first shots were carefully placed to disable rather than kill, striking weapons and wounding extremities in an attempt to end the threat with minimal loss of life. However, when one of the attackers continued fighting after being wounded, she was forced to use lethal force to protect herself. The firefight lasted less than 30 seconds, but the psychological impact on the surviving Night Riders was devastating. They had expected to terrorize a helpless victim, not engage in combat with a skilled professional who was better armed and trained than they were. Their confidence evaporated as they realized they had attacked someone who was more dangerous than they could have imagined. Two of the attackers were killed during the exchange of gunfire, while Marcus Webb and one associate were severely wounded, but alive. The remaining two gang members surrendered immediately when Carlos Mendez emerged from his sniper position and ordered them to the ground at gunpoint. The entire operation had been recorded by multiple cameras, providing clear evidence of self-defense. Detective Harrison arrived with backup units within minutes of the first shots being fired, followed quickly by paramedics and crime scene investigators. The evidence was overwhelming and clearly showed that Sarah had acted in self-defense against armed intruders who had forced entry into her home with intent to commit violent crimes. However, Sarah knew that the immediate threat was only part of a larger problem. The Night Riders had connections to other extremist groups throughout the region, and Marcus Webb's allies would likely seek revenge for what they would view as an attack on their movement. The fight for her family's safety was far from over, even though this particular battle had been won. As she gave her statement to investigating officers, Sarah realized that her actions had crossed a line that separated ordinary citizens from people who were willing to use violence to protect themselves and others. She had killed two human beings in her own kitchen, and regardless of the legal justification, that reality would stay with her for the rest of her life. The shooting investigation consumed the next 48 hours of Sarah's life as multiple law enforcement agencies examined every detail of the incident. Detective Harrison coordinated with the district attorney's office, internal affairs, and federal agents who specialized in domestic terrorism cases. Sarah's house became a crime scene, forcing her to stay in a hotel while forensic teams processed evidence. The legal conclusion was swift and decisive. Security footage from multiple angles showed clearly that the Night Riders had initiated the attack by forcing entry into Sarah's home while armed with deadly weapons. The audio recordings captured their threats and confirmed that they intended to commit serious violence against her. Under Arizona's castle doctrine and stand your ground laws, Sarah had been completely justified in using lethal force to defend herself. However, the media response was far more complicated than the legal judgment. News outlets across the country picked up the story within hours, and Sarah found herself at the center of a national debate about vigilante justice, gun rights, and the effectiveness of law enforcement. Her background as a former SWAT officer added complexity to the narrative that different political groups interpreted according to their own agendas. Conservative media portrayed Sarah as a hero who had defended her family against terrorist thugs when the legal system failed to protect law-abiding citizens. Talk radio hosts and cable news commentators praised her tactical skills and used her story to argue for stronger self-defense rights and more aggressive prosecution of domestic extremists. Liberal outlets focused on the fact that 2 young men were dead and questioned whether a trained law enforcement officer should have found non-lethal alternatives to resolve the situation. They expressed concern that Sarah's military-style preparation and coordination with former colleagues represented a dangerous trend toward privatized law enforcement that could escalate violence rather than preventing it. Social media exploded with opinions from people who knew nothing about tactical operations but felt qualified to judge Sarah's actions based on limited information and their own political beliefs. Her personal information was shared thousands of times, leading to both death threats from extremist supporters and marriage proposals from gun rights enthusiasts who saw her as a symbol of armed resistance. The most difficult aspect of the media attention was its impact on Emma and Jake. Sarah's sister had tried to shield the teenagers from news coverage, but classmates and teachers in Tucson recognized their names and began asking questions about their mother's involvement in the shooting. Both children struggled with the knowledge that their mother had killed people, even though they understood she had been protecting their family. Emma, who was 17 and already dealing with the stress of college applications, found herself defending her mother's actions to friends who had been influenced by social media commentary. Some of her classmates called Sarah a murderer, while others treated Emma like a celebrity because her mother was a badass cop. Neither reaction felt appropriate given the trauma their family had experienced. Jake, who was only 14, had a harder time processing the violence and its aftermath. He had nightmares about attackers breaking into their house and worried constantly that other gang members might target their family for revenge. His guitar practice, which had always been his escape from stress, became impossible because he couldn't concentrate on music while dealing with anxiety about his mother's safety. The legal system moved quickly to address the broader threat posed by the night riders and their affiliated groups. Marcus Webb, who survived his wounds but would require months of rehabilitation, was charged with conspiracy, home invasion, assault with a deadly weapon, and terrorism-related offenses that could result in life imprisonment. His surviving associates faced similar charges. Federal investigators used the incident as an opportunity to launch a comprehensive investigation into white supremacist and anti-government groups throughout the Southwest. They discovered that the night riders were part of a larger network that had been planning attacks against law enforcement officers, minority communities, and women who challenged traditional gender roles. The FBI raid on Marcus Webb's apartment complex uncovered a cache of weapons, explosives, and detailed plans for future attacks that went far beyond simple property destruction. The evidence revealed that Sarah's truck had been burned as a test case for a larger campaign of domestic terrorism designed to intimidate anyone who might resist their extremist ideology. Sarah's decision to fight back had inadvertently disrupted a much more serious threat to public safety. If she had simply accepted the initial attack and reported it through normal channels, the night riders would have continued escalating their activities until they eventually committed mass casualties. Her tactical response had forced them into premature action that exposed their entire operation to law enforcement. However, this knowledge provided little comfort as Sarah dealt with the psychological aftermath of the shooting. She had killed people before during her SWAT career, but those incidents had occurred in the line of duty with the full support of her department and community. This time, she had acted as a private citizen defending her home, which felt different even though the legal justification was identical. The department psychologist who had counseled Sarah after previous critical incidents helped her process the complex emotions associated with taking life in defense of her family. Dr. Patricia Williams explained that the psychological impact of justifiable homicide was often more severe when it occurred in personal rather than professional contexts. because the victim-defender dynamic created additional moral complexity. Sarah's former SWAT teammates rallied around her during the difficult period following the shooting. They understood better than anyone else the split-second decisions required in life-threatening situations and the burden of living with the consequences of those decisions. Their support helped Sarah maintain perspective about her actions and focus on protecting her family, rather than dwelling on guilt or regret. The practical challenges of returning to normal life proved almost as difficult as the emotional ones. Sarah's house required extensive repairs and cleaning before it could be habitable again, and her security consulting business faced uncertainty as potential clients wondered whether hiring her would expose them to similar risks from extremist groups. Some corporate clients canceled their contracts, concerned that Sarah's high profile might make their facilities targets for retaliation. However, other businesses specifically sought her services because her reputation for effective action had spread throughout the security industry. The net effect on her income was actually positive, though the nature of her work changed significantly. Sarah found herself specializing in protecting other victims of domestic terrorism and stalking, particularly women who had been targeted by extremist groups similar to the Night Riders. Her experience and proven track record made her uniquely qualified to help people who faced serious threats that traditional law enforcement couldn't address effectively. As the immediate crisis passed and media attention shifted to other stories, Sarah began planning for her family's long-term security. The Night Riders had been neutralized, but their ideology and tactics had supporters throughout the region who might view her as an ongoing threat to their movement. She would need to remain vigilant for years to ensure that her decision to fight back didn't ultimately put her children at greater risk. 6 months after the shooting, Sarah's life had found a new rhythm that balanced security concerns with her family's need for normalcy. Emma and Jake had returned home once their house was repaired and upgraded with comprehensive security systems. But the experience had changed all three of them in ways that would last forever. Emma had decided to accelerate her high school graduation and start college in the spring semester rather than waiting until fall. She chose a criminal justice program at Arizona State University, inspired by her mother's courage, but also motivated by her own desire to understand the legal system that had both failed and protected their family. Her essay about growing up with a SWAT officer mother had impressed admissions counselors and earned her a partial scholarship. Jake had channeled his anxiety about the attack into martial arts training and firearm safety courses. At 15, he was too young to carry weapons legally, but Sarah believed it was important for him to understand how to protect himself and others if faced with similar threats. His guitar playing had also evolved, with his compositions reflecting the intensity and complexity of emotions he had experienced during the crisis. Sarah's security consulting business had expanded beyond her expectations as word spread about her tactical expertise and willingness to take on dangerous cases. She now employed 4 former law enforcement officers and specialized in protecting victims of domestic terrorism, corporate executives facing death threats, and families involved in high-profile legal cases that attracted extremist attention. Her most challenging case involved protecting a federal judge who had received multiple death threats after sentencing several militia members to prison for plotting to bomb government buildings. The assignment required Sarah's team to coordinate with U.S. Marshals and FBI agents while maintaining the judge's ability to perform her duties without appearing to live in fear of retaliation. Another case involved a female CEO whose company had been targeted by environmental extremists who opposed her corporation's mining operations. The threats had escalated from social media harassment to suspicious packages and surveillance of the executive's family members. Sarah's team had identified and neutralized the threat through careful investigation and coordination with federal law enforcement. The success of these operations had established Sarah's reputation as someone who could handle situations that fell between traditional law enforcement capabilities and military operations. Her clients appreciated that she understood both the legal constraints that governed security operations and the tactical skills necessary to protect people from sophisticated threats. However, the most significant change in Sarah's life was her relationship with Detective Harrison, which had evolved from professional cooperation to personal partnership. Ray had been divorced for 3 years and understood the challenges of balancing law enforcement career demands with family responsibilities. Their shared experience during the Night Riders case had created a bond that gradually developed into romance. Emma and Jake, initially worried that their mother was dating a police officer because of residual trauma from the attack, but they came to appreciate Ray's protective presence and his genuine care for their family's well-being. He had been instrumental in ensuring that Marcus Webb and his associates received maximum sentences for their crimes, providing closure that helped the healing process. The trial of Marcus Webb had been a media sensation that lasted 3 weeks and resulted in his conviction on all charges. The evidence was overwhelming, including the security footage from Sarah's house and extensive documentation of the Night Riders' planning process. Webb was sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, effectively ending his ability to threaten anyone else. His surviving associates received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years, depending on their level of involvement in the conspiracy and their cooperation with federal investigators. The trials had revealed the full scope of the domestic terrorism network and led to dozens of additional arrests throughout Arizona and neighboring states. Sarah had been required to testify about the attack and her decision to fight back, reliving the traumatic events in front of cameras and reporters who analyzed every word for political significance. The experience was emotionally difficult, but it also provided an opportunity to explain her actions to a national audience and correct some of the misinformation that had circulated in social media. Her testimony had been particularly powerful when prosecutors asked her to describe the moment she realized the attackers intended to kill her. Sarah's composed explanation of her tactical, decision-making process had impressed jurors and demonstrated that her use of lethal force had been measured and necessary rather than excessive or vengeful. The federal investigation had also revealed connections between the Night Riders and similar groups in other states, leading to a coordinated law enforcement operation that disrupted domestic terrorism networks across the Southwest. Sarah's decision to fight back had ultimately contributed to preventing attacks that could have resulted in mass casualties at schools, government buildings, and minority community centers. This knowledge helped Sarah cope with the psychological burden of having killed 2 people, even though she continued to struggle with nightmares and anxiety related to the attack. Dr. Williams continued to provide counseling and helped Sarah develop coping strategies for dealing with the ongoing stress of running a high-risk security business while protecting her family. The most unexpected consequence of Sarah's experience was the number of other women who contacted her seeking advice about dealing with stalkers, abusive ex-husbands, and domestic terrorists who targeted them because of their gender, race, or political beliefs. Sarah found herself becoming an informal mentor and resource for victims who felt abandoned by traditional law enforcement. These conversations led Sarah to establish a nonprofit organization that provided security consulting services to victims who couldn't afford private protection. The Sarah Martinez Foundation received funding from corporate donors and individual contributors who supported its mission of empowering victims to protect themselves while working within the legal system. The Foundation's first major project was developing a training program that taught basic security awareness and self-defense skills to women who had been targeted by extremist groups. The curriculum combined practical tactical training with legal education about restraining orders, evidence collection, and cooperation with law enforcement agencies. Sarah also began speaking at law enforcement conferences about the growing threat posed by domestic terrorism and the importance of taking threats against civilians seriously before they escalated to violence. Her presentations emphasized that traditional reactive policing was inadequate when dealing with organized groups that planned their attacks carefully and targeted victims systematically. Her speaking engagements led to consulting opportunities with federal agencies that were struggling to address the rise in domestic terrorism cases. Sarah's unique perspective as both a former law enforcement officer and a victim of extremist violence provided valuable insights into how security professionals could better protect potential targets. As Sarah reflected on the year since her truck had been burned, she realized that the attack had ultimately strengthened her family and provided her with a new sense of purpose. The Night Riders had intended to terrorize her into submission, but instead they had awakened skills and determination that enabled her to protect not only her own family, but many other victims of similar threats. The final chapter of her story was still being written, But Sarah was confident that she had the tools and support necessary to face whatever challenges lay ahead. 2 years after the attack that changed her life, Sarah stood before a congressional committee investigating the rise of domestic terrorism in America. Her testimony represented the culmination of a journey that had transformed her from a victim into a national advocate for security reform and victim protection. The same tactical skills that had saved her family's lives were now being used to influence policy at the highest levels of government. The committee room was packed with reporters, law enforcement officials, and representatives from civil rights organizations who had followed Sarah's story since the Night Riders attack. Her prepared statement outlined specific recommendations for improving coordination between federal and local agencies when dealing with domestic terrorism threats. Based on her experience as both a law enforcement professional and a victim, Sarah's testimony focused on the critical gap between when threats were reported and when law enforcement could take meaningful action to protect potential victims. She explained how the legal system's emphasis on reactive rather than proactive measures had allowed the Night Riders to escalate their attacks while their victims waited helplessly for protection that came too late. Her recommendations included mandatory threat assessment training for local police departments, federal funding for victim protection programs, and legal reforms that would allow law enforcement to intervene earlier in domestic terrorism cases. Sarah's credibility as a former SWAT officer, who had successfully defended herself, gave weight to her suggestions and helped bridge the political divide that often paralyzed discussions about terrorism prevention. The committee's questions revealed the complexity of balancing civil liberties with public safety concerns. Sarah acknowledged these challenges while emphasizing that existing laws already provided adequate authority for law enforcement to act decisively against domestic terrorists. The problem was not legal limitations, but rather inadequate training, resources, and coordination between agencies. Emma, now a sophomore studying criminal justice at Arizona State University, watched her mother's testimony from the gallery with obvious pride. She had written her senior thesis on domestic terrorism prevention and planned to attend law school after graduation. The attack that had traumatized her family had also inspired her to pursue a career fighting the kind of extremism that had threatened their lives. Jake, now 16 and a junior in high school, had become an accomplished martial artist and planned to follow his mother's path into law enforcement after college. He had started a self-defense club at his school that taught other teenagers how to recognize and respond to threats, sharing lessons learned from his family's experience with domestic terrorism. Sarah's security consulting business had grown into a regional operation with offices in Phoenix, Denver, and Albuquerque. Her team of 12 former law enforcement officers specialized in protecting victims of domestic terrorism and had successfully resolved over 200 cases without a single client being seriously injured. The success rate had attracted attention from international security firms seeking to expand into the American market. The Sarah Martinez Foundation had trained over 5,000 women in security awareness and self-defense skills through programs offered at community colleges, churches, and women's centers throughout the Southwest. The training emphasized legal, compliance, and cooperation with law enforcement while teaching practical skills for recognizing and avoiding dangerous situations. The Foundation's most innovative program involved partnering with social media companies to identify and report online harassment that indicated potential escalation to physical violence. Sarah's team had developed algorithms that analyzed threat patterns and helped law enforcement prioritize cases based on risk assessment, rather than simply responding to the loudest complaints. Ray Harrison had retired from the police department and joined Sarah's business as head of investigations. Their professional partnership had evolved into marriage 6 months earlier, creating a blended family that included Ray's 12-year-old daughter from his previous marriage. The wedding had been a small ceremony, attended by former SWAT teammates and law enforcement colleagues who had supported Sarah throughout her ordeal. Marcus Webb had died in prison 3 months earlier, during a fight with another inmate who objected to his white supremacist ideology. His death had closed the final chapter on the Night Riders case and eliminated any possibility of future retaliation against Sarah's family. However, the extremist movement that had produced Webb continued to evolve and recruit new members who posed ongoing threats to public safety. The federal investigation that began with Sarah's case had resulted in over 300 arrests and the disruption of domestic terrorism networks in 15 states. Law enforcement agencies had developed new protocols for investigating extremist groups and protecting their potential victims, many of which were based on lessons learned from Sarah's experience. Sarah's congressional testimony concluded with a personal reflection on the cost of domestic terrorism for ordinary families. She described the ongoing psychological impact on her children and the difficulty of maintaining normal relationships when constantly aware of security threats. Her words helped committee members understand that domestic terrorism was not an abstract policy issue, but a real threat that affected real people in profound ways. The committee's final report, released 6 months later, included 12 of Sarah's recommendations and resulted in federal legislation that increased funding for domestic terrorism prevention programs. The Sarah Martinez Act, as it became known informally, provided grants for victim protection services and required federal agencies to share threat information more effectively with local law enforcement. Sarah's story had become a case study, taught at police academies and security training programs throughout the country. Her tactical response to the Night Riders attack was analyzed as an example of effective defensive planning, while her post-incident advocacy demonstrated how victims could channel their trauma into positive change that protected others. The most important measure of Sarah's success was not the legislation or business growth, but the safety of her family and the hundreds of other families her work had protected. Emma and Jake had grown into confident young adults who understood both the reality of evil in the world and their own capacity to resist it. They carried themselves with the quiet confidence that came from knowing their mother had faced the worst kind of threat and emerged victorious. As Sarah drove home from the congressional hearing, she reflected on the journey that had brought her family from victims to advocates. The Night Riders had intended to destroy their lives through intimidation and violence, but instead they had awakened a strength and purpose that would protect countless others from similar threats. The burned truck that had started everything had been replaced long ago, but Sarah kept a photograph of its charred remains on her office wall as a reminder of how quickly ordinary life could be shattered by extremist violence. Next to it hung pictures of the families her team had protected and the women who had graduated from her foundation's training programs. Sarah's story proved that victims of domestic terrorism didn't have to remain helpless when the legal system failed to protect them. With proper training, resources, and determination, ordinary citizens could defend themselves and their communities against extremist threats while working within the law to create lasting change. The ex-SWAT mom who had fought back against arsonists had become a symbol of resilience and effective action that inspired others to stand up against domestic terrorism. Her legacy would continue through the lives she had saved, the laws she had influenced, and the example she had set for anyone who refused to be intimidated by extremist violence.